Woman gives birth alone in forest and rescuers are shocked by what's beside her. What do they find? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sharp pain ripped through her abdomen, stealing her breath. Savannah barely managed to press the phone to her ear, her shaking fingers fumbling to keep the connection alive as the operator answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? Savannah panted, pressing her back against the thick trunk of an oak tree. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to give out. I'm lost. I went hiking. I wasn't due for 2 months, but the baby's coming. I don't know what to do. The operator's voice was calm but firm. Ma'am, I need you to stay as calm as possible. Where are you? Can you tell me what you see around you? Savannah's head swiveled, her tear-blurred vision taking in the dense forest. The sky above was tinged with orange, the setting sun filtering through the canopy. Birds called out, a discordant symphony that only deepened her panic. She bit down on the wave of another contraction and squeezed her eyes shut. Trees! There's just trees everywhere. I didn't mean to go off the trail, but I can't find my way back. Do you have a map? Or can you describe any landmarks, a river, rocks, anything? No map, Savannah whimpered. There was a small creek earlier, but it's not close anymore. She cried out as another contraction tightened her body like a vice. Oh God, the baby's coming too fast. The operator's voice softened, though it didn't lose its edge of authority. Savannah, listen carefully. Help is on the way, but it may take some time to locate you. We're going to need to prepare you to deliver the baby yourself. No, 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 Savannah gasped, her heart pounding harder than ever. This isn't supposed to happen. I'm not ready. I can't. You can, the operator interrupted firmly. You have to. Now, is the baby crowning? Can you feel its head? Savannah hesitated, her trembling hand moving instinctively toward her stomach. She lowered herself to the ground, using the tree for support, and braced as another contraction tore through her. She let out a strangled cry, the pain blinding her for a moment. I don't know. I think so. Okay, I need you to take slow, deep breaths, the operator instructed. When the next contraction comes, I need you to push. Do you understand? Savannah nodded, even though no one could see her, tears streaking down her dirt-smudged face. Her mind raced with every worst-case scenario. What if something went wrong? What if the baby wasn't okay? What if they didn't find her in time? But she had no choice. She couldn't sit here paralyzed by fear. The next contraction hit like a tidal wave, and Savannah screamed, her body instinctively bearing down. Every muscle felt as though it were on fire, her vision swimming. She could hear the operator's steady encouragement, but her focus was singular, locked on the impossible task of bringing her baby into the world alone. Minutes blurred together, an eternity of pain and panic. Finally, with one last desperate push, a sharp, piercing cry shattered the stillness of the forest. Savannah collapsed back against the tree, her chest heaving as she cradled the tiny, wriggling bundle in her arms. The baby's cries filled the air, a sound so raw and alive that it left her sobbing with relief. It's a girl, Savannah choked out, her voice trembling. She's okay. The operator's voice returned, steady as ever. That's amazing, Savannah. You did it. Now, you need to keep her warm. Do you have anything to wrap her in? Savannah tore off her jacket, bundling it around the baby as best she could. She pressed the infant close to her chest, her heart aching with love and fear in equal measure. I have her, but you have to find us. Please. We're tracking your phone's signal. Help is on the way, the operator assured her. You're not alone. Savannah wanted to believe that, but the weight of her situation pressed down on her. Her body was trembling from exhaustion, and the temperature was dropping fast as night began to settle over the forest. She looked around, her senses heightened in the oppressive silence. The forest felt different now, watchful. She clutched her daughter tighter, her instincts flaring as she thought she saw movement in the shadows. Her voice shook as she whispered, I think something's out here with us. What do you mean? The operator asked, the first hint of alarm creeping into their voice. Savannah's heart raced as she peered into the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. She thought she heard the rustling of leaves, but it could have been the wind. Or it could have been something else. Her breath quickened, panic threatening to consume her again. It's probably just animals, the operator said, trying to reassure her. Wildlife is common in these areas. No, Savannah whispered, her grip tightening on her daughter. It doesn't feel like animals. It feels like something's watching us. The baby let out a soft whimper, and Savannah's heart clenched. She didn't know what was out there, but she knew one thing for certain. She would do whatever it took to protect her child. The distant wail of sirens pierced the night air, a beacon of hope that pushed Savannah to keep going. But as the sound drew closer, so did something else, something that made her blood run cold. The rustling grew louder, deliberate now, too calculated to be the aimless movements of an animal. Savannah's entire body stiffened. She clutched her newborn tighter to her chest, her instincts on overdrive. Whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. The forest felt alive with tension, each sound amplified by her heightened senses. "Savannah?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone. "Stay on the line. The rescue team is close to your location. Do not move unless absolutely necessary." Savannah nodded reflexively, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But her survival instincts were screaming louder than the operator's calm instructions. Something, or someone, was there. The feeling was primal, a deep-seated fear that made her heart pound so hard it felt like it would burst. "Who's there?" she croaked into the darkness, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot. She felt the hair on her neck rise. Slowly, she reached for the nearest sturdy branch she could find, gripping it with one hand while still cradling her baby with the other. She wouldn't go down without a fight. A shadow shifted in the periphery of her vision. Savannah squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Her first thought was a deer. Large, graceful, moving silently through the underbrush. But as the figure came closer, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. He emerged from the shadows slowly, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. His clothes were ragged, his face obscured by an overgrown beard and dirt. Savannah tightened her grip on the branch, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking with fear. "Stay back." The man paused, his dark eyes scanning her and the bundled baby in her arms. "Easy," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm not here to hurt you. You shouldn't be out here. It's not safe." She didn't lower the branch. "No kidding. You think I planned this?" He stepped closer, and she shifted, angling the stick toward him. "I said stay back." All right, he said, stopping a few feet away. His hands remained raised, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes that unsettled her. Curiosity, perhaps, or something darker. "You've got a newborn there. You're not going to last long out here, not in your condition." "I don't need your help," Savannah snapped. "Rescue is already on the way." The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a grim smile. "You think they'll find you in time? This forest has swallowed people whole. Days, weeks, sometimes they're never found, but I can help you?" Savannah's stomach twisted. Something about his tone sent a chill down her spine. "Why would you help me?" The man shrugged. "Because I know these woods. I've lived out here for years. I can get you somewhere safe. You and the baby." She shook her head, backing up a step. The pain in her body flared as she moved, reminding her of how fragile she was in this moment. "No, stay away." The man's smile faded, and his expression hardened. "You don't have much of a choice, lady. There are worse things out here than me." The words struck her like a blow. Worse things? What did he mean? But before she could respond, the distant sirens grew louder, a beacon of hope cutting through the oppressive fear. The man scowled, his gaze shifting toward the direction of the noise. "They're close," he muttered. "You'd better hope they get to you before night falls completely." With that, he melted back into the shadows, disappearing as swiftly as he had come. Savannah's legs nearly gave out as relief and terror surged through her. What kind of person just lived out here? And what did he mean by worse things? The sound of crunching leaves and snapping branches came again, but this time it wasn't the man. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and Savannah's knees buckled as a group of rescue workers rushed toward her. "Savannah!" one of them called. "Are you all right?" She couldn't speak. She just held out the baby, tears streaming down her face as she sagged into the arms of her rescuers. Relief washed over her as they wrapped her and the baby in blankets, checking their vitals and murmuring reassurances. But as they carried her out of the forest, Savannah couldn't stop glancing back over her shoulder. The man's words echoed in her mind, a sinister reminder that the forest held secrets she might never fully understand. Worse things. When the rescuers asked if she'd seen anything unusual, she hesitated before shaking her head. For now, she needed to focus on her daughter and her own survival. But deep down, she knew this was far from over. Savannah lay in the hospital bed, her daughter nestled against her chest. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, a sharp contrast to the oppressive quiet of the forest she had just escaped. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals and cooing over the baby, but Savannah barely registered their presence. Her mind was elsewhere, back in the woods, replaying the encounter with the strange man and his cryptic warning. Her husband, Daniel, burst into the room, his face pale with worry. "Savannah!" he exclaimed, rushing to her side. "Are you okay? Is the baby—" "We're fine," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "She's fine. But it was close." Daniel kissed her forehead, tears brimming in his eyes. "Don't ever scare me like that again. I thought, when they said you were lost in the woods in labor, I thought I'd lose both of you." She offered a weak smile, but her thoughts were still clouded. She wanted to tell him everything, about the man, his warning, and the eerie sense that something was still lurking out there. But the words felt heavy, stuck in her throat. What if he thought she was imagining things? Or worse, what if she was imagining things? Over the next few days, Savannah focused on recovering and bonding with her baby, whom they named Lily. Yet the forest refused to leave her alone. Her dreams were plagued with dark trees and shadowy figures, and she often woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding as though she were still running for her life. Daniel chalked it up to trauma, urging her to rest and assuring her that everything was fine now. But it wasn't fine. One evening, as she was rocking Lily to sleep in the hospital's dimly lit maternity ward, she noticed a figure standing just outside the window. Her breath hitched, and her grip on the baby tightened. The figure was tall, motionless, and completely obscured by the shadows cast by the parking lot lights. For a moment, she thought it was the man from the forest. "Daniel?" she called softly, panic rising in her chest. Her husband, sitting on the couch nearby, looked up from his phone. "What's wrong?" She gestured toward the window, but when he turned to look, the figure was gone. "There was someone there," she stammered. "Standing right there." Daniel frowned, walking over to the window and peering out. "There's no one out here, Savannah. Maybe you saw a shadow or—" "No," she insisted. "I saw someone." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've been through a lot. It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you. Let's talk to the doctor tomorrow, okay? Maybe they can help." Savannah nodded reluctantly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no trick of the mind. Something, or someone, was watching her. A week later, Savannah and Lily were discharged from the hospital. Daniel drove them home, his voice light and cheerful as he tried to distract her from the lingering anxiety. Their house, nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, should have felt like a haven. Instead, it felt exposed, vulnerable. The back porch faced a stretch of dense woods, and Savannah couldn't help but draw the blinds as soon as they arrived. "Are you sure you're okay?" Daniel asked as he carried Lily's car seat inside. She forced a smile. "I'm just tired. I'll feel better after some rest." But rest didn't come. That night, Savannah lay awake, the baby monitor glowing softly on her nightstand. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside made her flinch. Her eyes darted to the window more times than she could count, half expecting to see a face staring back at her. Around 3 a.m., the baby monitor crackled. At first, Savannah thought it was just static, but then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper. Savannah. Her heart stopped. She bolted upright, staring at the monitor in disbelief. The camera feed showed Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib, but the whisper came again, louder this time. Savannah, the woods remember, she screamed, waking Daniel, who fumbled for the light. What's wrong? He demanded, his voice thick with sleep. She pointed at the monitor, her hands shaking. It said my name. Someone, something, was speaking. Daniel grabbed the monitor and stared at it, but the static was gone. The screen displayed nothing unusual. Savannah, there's nothing here. No, she insisted, her voice rising. I heard it. It said my name and… Her voice broke as tears streamed down her face. It said the woods remember. Daniel pulled her into a hug, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. You're exhausted. You've been through so much. Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist, or… I'm not crazy, she snapped, pulling away. Something followed me out of that forest. Daniel didn't argue, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't believe her. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became more frequent. Savannah found muddy footprints leading up to the back porch, even though it hadn't rained. The baby monitor picked up faint whispers at odd hours, though she could never make out what they were saying. And the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if the forest itself had eyes trained on her home. One morning, she awoke to find a bundle of sticks arranged in a strange pattern on the porch. At the center of the pattern was a small tuft of fur and a smear of what looked like blood. She recoiled, her stomach turning as she slammed the door shut. Daniel dismissed it as a prank by local kids. You're letting this get to you, he said. We'll put up some cameras. That'll make you feel better, right? Savannah nodded, but deep down, she knew this wasn't something cameras could stop. The man's words haunted her. There are worse things out here than me. Whatever had watched her in the forest wasn't done with her yet. And now, it was closer than ever. Savannah tried to push forward, focusing on her recovery and Lily's care, but the unease gnawed at her constantly. The cameras Daniel installed did little to soothe her nerves. Every night she found herself glued to the live feeds, scanning the screens for any sign of movement. Nothing ever appeared, but the growing sense of dread never left her. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled outside, Savannah woke to a faint tapping sound. Her heart sank. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, coming from the window in Lily's room. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing the baby monitor. The feed showed Lily sleeping peacefully, but the tapping continued, faint and insistent. Savannah shook Daniel awake. Daniel, someone's outside Lily's window, she whispered urgently. He groaned, pulling the covers over his head. It's probably a tree branch. I'll check in the morning. No, Daniel, she hissed, shaking his shoulder harder. It's not a tree, it's something else. Reluctantly, Daniel threw off the blanket and grabbed the baseball bat he had stashed in the corner of the room. Savannah followed closely behind as he stalked down the hallway toward Lily's room. The tapping continued, louder now, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew they were approaching. Daniel flung open the door to Lily's room. Savannah rushed to the crib and scooped Lily into her arms, holding her tightly. Daniel stepped cautiously toward the window, his knuckles whitening around the bat. Savannah held her breath as he pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just darkness. See, it's nothing, Daniel said with a sigh, dropping the bat to his side. But Savannah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out. The porch light barely illuminated the edge of the forest beyond their yard, but she swore she saw movement in the shadows. There, she whispered, pointing. Daniel squinted, leaning closer to the window. I don't see anything. It's probably an animal, Savannah. Go back to bed. But Savannah couldn't sleep. The rest of the night she sat in the rocking chair with Lily, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Morning came without further incident, but Savannah was far from reassured. A few days later, the first real evidence appeared. Daniel called her outside one morning, his voice uneasy. Savannah, you need to see this. She stepped onto the porch, squinting against the bright sunlight. Daniel was standing at the edge of the yard, near the line where the lawn met the forest. He pointed to the ground, and Savannah's stomach lurched. There, embedded in the mud, were massive footprints. Too big to be human. The prints were elongated, with clawed toes that looked as though they'd been dug deep into the earth. What? What is that? Savannah asked, her voice trembling. Daniel shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know. Maybe a bear, but... He trailed off, glancing toward the forest. It doesn't look right. The shape, the size... Savannah shivered, clutching Lily closer to her chest. It's not a bear. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, clearly trying to keep calm for her sake. I'll call animal control. Maybe they can figure it out. But Savannah knew animal control wouldn't have answers. Whatever had left those prints wasn't just an animal. The following night, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't limited to the baby monitor. Savannah heard them in her own room, faint but distinct. A low, raspy voice calling her name. Savannah, come back. She covered her ears, trying to block it out, but the voice seemed to seep into her very bones. It wasn't just calling her, it was beckoning her, drawing her attention back to the forest. She pressed her hands tighter against her ears and squeezed her eyes shut. But the whispers didn't stop until dawn. Desperate, she confided in Daniel the next morning. It's calling me, she said, her voice shaking. It wants me to go back. Daniel frowned, his patience wearing thin. Savannah, this has gone on long enough. You're scaring yourself over nothing. The footprints, the whispers. It's all in your head. It's not in my head, she snapped, tears spilling down her cheeks. You didn't hear it, Daniel. It knows my name. It knows where I live. Daniel sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. I'll set up more cameras, okay? I'll even stay up with you tonight if that'll help. But you need to stop letting this get to you. Savannah didn't respond. She didn't have the energy to argue. All she could do was hold Lily close and pray that Daniel was right. But that night, as the house fell silent, Savannah felt the pull of the forest more strongly than ever. The whispers didn't just call to her this time. They begged. And she knew, deep down, that she couldn't ignore them forever. Something in those woods wanted her. And if she didn't go back, it might come for her instead. Savannah lay awake in bed, her heart pounding as the whispers began again. This time they were louder, more urgent, filling her head with an eerie rhythm she couldn't escape. She clutched Lily to her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The voice was no longer just calling. It was commanding. Savannah, you can't run. Come back. She bolted upright, her gaze darting around the room. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the forest itself had invaded her sanctuary. She nudged Daniel awake, desperation evident in her voice. Daniel, it's happening again. The whispers. They're louder this time. Please, you have to believe me. Daniel groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Savannah, there's nothing out there. You're sleep-deprived and stressed. You need to rest. Look at me, she snapped, her voice cracking. Do I look like I'm imagining this? Something wants me to go back to the forest, and if I don't... She trailed off, her hands trembling as she hugged Lily tighter. Daniel sighed, his frustration evident. Fine, let's check the cameras again. They crept into the living room, where the feeds from the outdoor cameras played on a small monitor. Savannah leaned forward, scanning each angle for movement. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then she saw it, a flicker of motion at the edge of the forest. Her breath hitched as she pointed to the screen. There, she whispered. Daniel squinted at the monitor. It's probably just a raccoon or... Before he could finish, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its posture unnaturally rigid. The camera's night vision cast the figure in a ghostly light, highlighting the gaunt, twisted features of its face. Savannah's blood ran cold. That's not an animal, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel stared, his face pale. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Stay here, he said, grabbing the baseball bat from the corner. Are you insane? Savannah hissed. You're not going out there. I'm not letting some lunatic stalk our house, Daniel said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. He kissed her forehead and handed her the phone. If anything happens, call the police. Savannah watched helplessly as Daniel stepped outside, his figure illuminated by the porch light. She clutched the phone, her heart racing as she kept her eyes on the cameras. The figure was gone, vanished into the darkness. But the unease remained, heavy and suffocating. Minutes felt like hours as she waited. The cameras showed no sign of Daniel or the figure. Then, just as she was about to call out for him, the whispers started again, this time from inside the house. Savannah. Come. Back. Her blood froze. She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto the hallway. The air felt colder, the shadows darker. She tightened her grip on Lily, backing toward the living room window. Daniel? She called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. A loud bang echoed from the back door, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Savannah screamed, clutching Lily as she ran to the front door. Her hands fumbled with the lock, her vision blurred with panic. Before she could open it, the whispers grew deafening, as though they were coming from every corner of the house. Savannah, you can't escape. The door finally gave way, and she stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting her like a wave. She ran down the driveway, her bare feet slapping against the pavement as she screamed for help. The neighbors' houses were dark, the street eerily silent. Behind her, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, closing in. She turned, her heart nearly stopping as she saw the figure from the camera standing at the edge of the driveway. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, its twisted limbs twitching unnaturally as it took a step closer. Leave us alone, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying her. Then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl and retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Savannah collapsed onto the ground, clutching Lily as she sobbed. Moments later, Daniel appeared, running up the driveway with the bat in hand. His face was pale, his breathing labored. Savannah, are you okay? What happened? She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror. It was here, she whispered. It's not going to stop. Daniel pulled her into his arms, his own fear evident as he tried to reassure her. We'll figure this out. I'll call the police. We'll leave if we have to. But deep down, Savannah knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was haunting her wasn't bound to the forest. It had followed her home, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Savannah lay awake in bed, her heart pounding as the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, more urgent, filling her head with an eerie rhythm she couldn't escape. She clutched Lily to her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The voice was no longer just calling, it was commanding. Savannah, you can't run. Come back. She bolted upright, her gaze darting around the room. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the forest itself had invaded her sanctuary. She nudged Daniel awake, desperation evident in her voice. Daniel, it's happening again. The whispers. They're louder this time. Please, you have to believe me. Daniel groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Savannah, there's nothing out there. You're sleep-deprived and stressed. You need to rest. Look at me, she snapped, her voice cracking. Do I look like I'm imagining this? Something wants me to go back to the forest, and if I don't... She trailed off, her hands trembling as she hugged Lily tighter. Daniel sighed, his frustration evident. Fine, let's check the cameras again. They crept into the living room, where the feeds from the outdoor cameras played on a small monitor. Savannah leaned forward, scanning each angle for movement. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then she saw it, a flicker of motion at the edge of the forest. Her breath hitched as she pointed to the screen. There, she whispered. Daniel squinted at the monitor. It's probably just a raccoon or... Before he could finish, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its posture unnaturally rigid. The camera's night vision cast the figure in a ghostly light, highlighting the gaunt, twisted features of its face. Savannah's blood ran cold. "That's not an animal," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel stared, his face pale. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the baseball bat from the corner. "Are you insane?" Savannah hissed. "You're not going out there." "I'm not letting some lunatic stalk our house," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. He kissed her forehead and handed her the phone. "If anything happens, call the police." Savannah watched helplessly as Daniel stepped outside, his figure illuminated by the porch light. She clutched the phone, her heart racing as she kept her eyes on the cameras. The figure was gone, vanished into the darkness. But the unease remained, heavy and suffocating. Minutes felt like hours as she waited. The cameras showed no sign of Daniel or the figure. Then, just as she was about to call out for him, the whispers started again, this time from inside the house. "Savannah, come back." Her blood froze. She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto the hallway. The air felt colder, the shadows darker. She tightened her grip on Lily, backing toward the living room window. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. A loud bang echoed from the back door, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Savannah screamed, clutching Lily as she ran to the front door. Her hands fumbled with the lock, her vision blurred with panic. Before she could open it, the whispers grew deafening, as though they were coming from every corner of the house. "Savannah, you can't escape." The door finally gave way, and she stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting her like a wave. She ran down the driveway, her bare feet slapping against the pavement as she screamed for help. The neighbors' houses were dark, the street eerily silent. Behind her, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, closing in. She turned, her heart nearly stopping as she saw the figure from the camera standing at the edge of the driveway. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, its twisted limbs twitching unnaturally as it took a step closer. "Leave us alone!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying her. Then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl and retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Savannah collapsed onto the ground, clutching Lily as she sobbed. Moments later, Daniel appeared, running up the driveway with the bat in hand. His face was pale, his breathing labored. "Savannah, are you okay? What happened?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror. "It was here," she whispered. "It's not going to stop." Daniel pulled her into his arms, his own fear evident as he tried to reassure her. "We'll figure this out. I'll call the police. We'll leave if we have to." But deep down, Savannah knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was haunting her wasn't bound to the forest. It had followed her home, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. The police arrived within the hour, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet street. Savannah sat on the couch, clutching Lily to her chest while Daniel explained everything. Well, almost everything. He left out the whispers, the inexplicable cold, and the distorted figure, chalking it up to a trespasser trying to scare them. Savannah didn't correct him. She wasn't sure how to explain the truth without sounding unhinged. One of the officers, a grizzled man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped into the living room. "We've swept the perimeter," he said, his tone clipped. "Found some footprints near the back window, but they vanish once they hit the forest. We'll patrol the area tonight, but if it's just some prankster, they've probably moved on." Savannah shook her head, her voice trembling. "It's not a prankster." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am?" "It's something else," she whispered, her grip tightening on Lily. "It's been following me since I got lost in the forest." Daniel interjected quickly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She's been through a lot lately. She's just shaken up." The officer nodded, though his skepticism was evident. "Understandable. Try to get some rest tonight. Let us know if anything else happens." As the police left, Savannah turned to Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears. You don't believe me. It's not that, Daniel said, rubbing his temples. I just, I don't know how to explain what's happening. And neither do you. Let's take this one step at a time, okay? Savannah didn't respond. Exhaustion weighed her down, but sleep felt impossible. That night she sat in Lily's room, rocking the baby back and forth as the whispers returned. Faint, insidious, wrapping around her like a cold wind. Savannah, come back. She clutched Lily tighter, humming a lullaby in a desperate attempt to drown out the sound. The hours crawled by, and just as dawn began to break, the whispers stopped. Savannah finally allowed herself to relax, her body slumping with relief. But the respite was short-lived. When she glanced at the crib, her heart stopped. The bundle of sticks she had seen on the porch days earlier was now sitting at the foot of Lily's bed. How it had gotten there, she had no idea, but the sight of it sent a chill down her spine. Savannah screamed, waking Daniel, who rushed into the room bleary-eyed and panicked. "What's wrong?" She pointed to the crib, her voice trembling. "It's here. That thing is in our house." Daniel's eyes widened as he saw the bundle. "How did that get here?" "I don't know," Savannah cried, "but it's a warning. It's telling me I have to go back." "Go back where?" Daniel asked, though his voice lacked its usual skepticism. He was starting to realize this was no longer just Savannah's imagination. "The forest," she whispered. "It wants me to return. And if I don't—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "This is insane. We're not going back there." "We don't have a choice," Savannah snapped. "You saw what it's capable of. It's not going to stop. Not until it gets what it wants." Daniel hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect his family and his disbelief in what was happening. Finally, he nodded. "If we're doing this, we're not doing it alone. I'll call someone. A guide? A tracker? Someone who knows the forest." Savannah's relief was tempered by fear. She didn't want to go back, but she knew there was no other way. The following morning, Daniel made good on his word and found a wilderness guide named Greg, a seasoned tracker with decades of experience navigating the forest. Greg arrived at the house, his demeanor calm but professional, his sharp eyes assessing the anxious couple. Savannah cradled Lily tightly as Greg listened to their story. While Daniel kept the supernatural details vague, Savannah couldn't help blurting out the truth. "There's something in the forest," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not human, and it's not an animal. It's something else." Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he nodded slowly. "I've heard stranger things. The woods can play tricks on people. If you need to go back, I'll get you there safely. But I'll warn you, out there, you follow my lead." Savannah and Daniel exchanged a look before nodding. They packed quickly, Daniel grabbing a flashlight and a knife while Savannah readied Lily's baby carrier. Her stomach churned as they stepped outside. She felt the pull of the forest immediately, a force that seemed to draw her forward like a magnet. Greg led the way with swift confidence, cutting through the underbrush with a machete. Savannah followed close behind, her heart pounding with every step. The deeper they went, the darker and quieter the forest became. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, closing in around them. "How much farther?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. "Not long," Savannah whispered. She didn't know how she knew, but the pull was growing stronger, the whispers in her mind louder. They weren't words anymore, just an incessant hum that made her head throb. Finally, they entered the clearing where Savannah had given birth. She froze, staring at the spot beneath the tree where it had all happened. The ground was disturbed, as though something, or someone, had been digging there recently. At the center of the clearing was a new bundle of sticks, larger and more intricately arranged than the ones she'd seen before. Greg frowned, crouching down to examine the bundle. "This isn't random," he muttered. "Looks like some kind of ritual or marker." Savannah barely heard him. The air had grown impossibly cold, and the hum in her head was deafening. She stumbled back, clutching Lily, as a low growl rumbled through the clearing. Daniel grabbed her arm, his eyes darting around. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. Greg stood, his machete at the ready. "Stay close. Something's here," The growl deepened, reverberating through the trees. Then, from the shadows it emerged. The figure was taller than before, its limbs grotesquely long, its glowing eyes fixed on Savannah. It moved with unnatural jerks, each step accompanied by the sound of snapping twigs. "Savannah, you came back," the voice rasped, though its mouth didn't move. Greg raised his machete, stepping between the creature and the group. "Get back," he barked. The creature paused, tilting its head as if amused. Then, faster than anyone could react, it lunged. Greg swung the machete, the blade slicing into the creature's arm, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it swiped at him with clawed hands, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crack. Savannah screamed, clutching Lily as Daniel dragged her backward. "Run!" he shouted, but the creature blocked their path, its hollow eyes boring into Savannah. "You took something from me," it hissed. "Now, I'll take it back." "I didn't take anything," Savannah cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know what you want." The creature pointed a gnarled finger at Lily. "The child. She is mine." "No!" Savannah screamed, backing away. Daniel stepped in front of her, brandishing his knife, but the creature knocked him aside effortlessly. It reached for Savannah, its claws inches from Lily's face. Suddenly, a bright flash of light filled the clearing, and the creature recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting screech. Savannah turned to see Greg, battered and bleeding, but holding up a flare. The light seemed to burn the creature, its twisted form writhing as it backed into the shadows. "Go!" Greg yelled, his voice strained. "Run now!" Savannah didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted, clutching Lily as Daniel scrambled to his feet and followed. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at them as they ran. The whispers grew louder, blending with the creature's enraged howls. Ahead, Savannah saw a faint glimmer of light, the edge of the forest. Her legs burned, her lungs screaming for air, but she didn't stop. She burst through the trees, collapsing onto the ground as Daniel stumbled out behind her. The creature's howls faded, and the forest fell silent. Savannah looked back, expecting it to follow, but the trees remained still. Greg emerged moments later, his face pale and bloodied. "Is it gone?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. "For now," Greg said, collapsing to his knees. "But whatever that thing is, it's tied to this place. It won't leave." Savannah cradled Lily, tears streaming down her face. "Why does it want her?" Greg shook his head. "I don't know, but if you want to keep her safe, you need to stay far away from this forest. Don't come back." Savannah nodded, her mind racing. She didn't know how she'd protect Lily from something so relentless, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. Savannah sat in the emergency room, clutching Lily to her chest. Daniel was beside her, his hand resting on her knee, grounding her in the moment. Across from them, Greg sat slumped in a chair, his arm in a sling and his face smeared with dried blood. They had escaped the forest, but the terror hadn't left her. It lingered in her mind, a shadow she couldn't shake. The attending doctor approached, his face etched with concern. "You're lucky to have made it out. Your injuries will heal, but you need to rest. If you want, we can arrange for counseling. Trauma like this can leave scars." Savannah nodded absently, her mind still replaying the encounter. The creature's words echoed in her ears. "The child. She is mine." After Greg was discharged, Daniel insisted on driving him home. Savannah sat silently in the back seat, watching the trees blur past the car window. The thought of leaving her home, her safety, seemed impossible, but she knew Greg was right. They had to get far away from the forest. When they dropped Greg off, he leaned into the window, his expression grim. "That thing isn't done with you," he said. "If it's tied to the child, it'll find a way. You need to protect her at all costs." "We will," Daniel said firmly, gripping the steering wheel. Savannah couldn't speak. She simply nodded, her arms tightening around Lily. 2 weeks later, Savannah and Daniel moved into a rental house in a new town, hundreds of miles away from the forest. The small suburban neighborhood felt safe, ordinary, a stark contrast to the oppressive woods. They sold their old house without a second thought, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. It was a fresh start. Savannah spent her days focused on Lily, cherishing every moment with her daughter. But even in the safety of their new home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, she'd catch a shadow out of the corner of her eye or hear a faint whisper in the still of the night. She tried to tell herself it was paranoia, a lingering effect of her trauma, but deep down, she knew better. One night, as she rocked Lily to sleep, the whispers returned. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Savannah. She belongs to me. Her heart stopped, and she clutched Lily tighter. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. You can't have her. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to darken. Savannah's breath came in short gasps as she glanced around, her eyes darting to every shadow. But there was nothing there. Just the suffocating silence. Daniel burst into the room moments later, alarmed by her scream. What happened? It was here, Savannah whispered, her voice breaking. I heard it again. Daniel knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. It's over. You're safe. Lily's safe. We're far away from that place. Savannah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It doesn't matter how far we go. It'll never stop. Daniel hesitated, then pulled her into a tight embrace. We'll find a way to end this, whatever it takes. Months passed, and the whispers subsided. Life returned to a fragile sense of normalcy. Savannah started seeing a therapist, and Daniel immersed himself in research, determined to understand what had happened in the forest. He scoured forums, old folklore, and local legends, piecing together fragments of information about the creature. One evening, he came into the living room, a thick book in hand. I think I found something. Savannah looked up from the couch, where she was nursing Lily. What is it? It's called a Watcher, Daniel said, flipping through the pages. It's an ancient entity tied to the land. It marks people who trespass into its territory, especially those who take something it deems its own. Savannah paled. Lily, Daniel nodded. It must think Lily is part of its domain because she was born there. But there's a way to sever the connection. What is it? Savannah asked, her voice trembling. Daniel hesitated. We have to return to the forest. Perform a ritual to give the Watcher closure. It's dangerous, but it's the only way to end this. Savannah's stomach turned. The thought of going back terrified her, but she couldn't live in fear forever. She looked at Lily, her tiny face peaceful in sleep, and nodded. We'll do it. The journey back to the forest felt surreal, like stepping into a nightmare she had tried to forget. Greg agreed to guide them again, though his reluctance was palpable. He carried the supplies needed for the ritual, a mixture of herbs, a stone carved with symbols, and a small flamekeeper lantern. Savannah carried Lily, her heart racing as they entered the familiar clearing. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The bundle of sticks lay in the center of the clearing, now surrounded by strange markings carved into the ground. Greg lit the lantern, its warm glow flickering as he handed it to Savannah. Place this in the center of the ring, he instructed. Then we'll chant the words. It should sever the connection. Savannah nodded, her hands trembling as she approached the center. The moment she stepped into the circle, the air grew icy. The whispers returned, louder and more aggressive. No, you cannot take her. The ground trembled, and shadows began to writhe around them. The Watcher emerged from the trees, its grotesque form more terrifying than before. It let out an enraged screech, its glowing eyes fixed on Savannah. Hurry! Greg shouted, pulling out his machete as Daniel stepped in front of Savannah to shield her. Savannah placed the lantern in the center, her voice shaking as she began to chant the words Greg had taught her. The Watcher lunged, but Greg intercepted it, swinging his machete with all his strength. Daniel grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it out, forcing the creature back. The chanting grew louder, the lantern's flame flaring brighter until it consumed the entire clearing in a brilliant light. The Watcher let out an ear-piercing scream, its form disintegrating into the air like ash. The ground stopped trembling, and the forest fell silent. Savannah collapsed to her knees, clutching Lily as tears streamed down her face. Is it over? She whispered. Greg nodded, his face pale. It's done. The connection is broken. The three of them left the forest, their bodies and spirits battered but alive. Savannah and Daniel never returned to the area, and as Lily grew, the whispers and shadows faded from their lives. Years later, Savannah would sit in a new home, watching her daughter play in the yard, the sun shining down on her carefree smile. The terror of the Watcher still lingered in her memory, but it no longer had power over her. They had faced the darkness and won. Finally, they were free.